Zach Eflin is turning into not just one of the biggest deadline additions by the Orioles, but one of the biggest deadline additions in Major League Baseball this year. He spins another gem as the Orioles win the first game of the series against the Red Sox. And I'll recap it all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, August 16th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap the Orioles' 5-1 victory over the Boston Red Sox on Thursday night in game one of a 4-game weekend set at Oriole Park. I'll get you the 5 things you need to know from that one, including another great Zach Eflin start. The Orioles getting the big hits when it mattered, and the bullpen locking it down for the second straight night. Then we'll talk about the roster move, or at least the big one that the Orioles made on Thursday. Coby Mayo, despite getting his first hit on Wednesday, sent back down to AAA Norfolk. What it means for Mayo's future with the O's and what it means for the Orioles roster, both currently and heading down the stretch towards the postseason. And then finally, a couple of other Orioles news and notes. They bring in another depth reliever in Matt Bowman. I'll tell you why he could help the Orioles bullpen this year. And everyone's favorite broadcaster, Kevin Brown, is officially sticking around in Baltimore. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedonmlb and use code all lowercase lockedonmlb for a first deposit match up to $100. So we'll start today with an Orioles victory in game one of a 4-game series at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, kicking off on Thursday night. Your final score is the Orioles 5 and the Boston Red Sox 1, as the O's get to 72-50 on the season, and with the Yankees off on Thursday before they travel to Detroit to play the Tigers this weekend, the Orioles have once again jumped back into first place. They're in a tie with New York atop the division, but because the O's have won 6 out of 10 against the Yankees this year, currently lead the season series. Technically, if the season ended today, they would be AL East champs. So I'm putting them in first place for that. Now I'm going to get you the 5 things you need to know from the Orioles 5-1 win over the Red Sox. And the first thing you need to know is Zach Eflin was absolutely dynamite again in an Oriole uniform. Season high 8 strikeouts for Eflin. He goes 6 innings of 1-run ball. The only thing he gave up, a solo home run to Wilyer Abreu, leadoff homer on a curveball that was kind of whipped into the flag court in the 4th inning that put Boston up 1-0. That was it. He scattered 4 other hits beyond that. He struck out 8. It was an Eflin special. He did not walk anyone on 87 pitches, 8 hard hit balls against him. He was just magical once again. And Zach Eflin, not really known as a strikeout pitcher, and yet, you know, we're looking at his tenure with the Orioles so far since they acquired him for 3 prospects from the Rays at the trade deadline. And he's now made 4 starts, and it's gone 7 Ks, 3 Ks, 7 Ks, 8 Ks. He struck out 7 only once in a Rays uniform this year. He's done it in 3 of 4 starts with the Orioles. Even better, he's gone at least 6 innings in all 4 starts, 6 innings, 6 1/3, 7 innings, 6 innings, and has quite frankly been incredible. 6 runs allowed in his 4 starts with the O's. And on this night, it was the high cutter. The high cutter was his pitch. Now, once again, he threw more cutters than anything else. Eflin is always going to mix his pitch as well. 29 cutters, 27 four-seamers, 17 sinkers. So, you know, it's not like it was 70% cutters. It was 1/3 cutters, 29 out of 87 pitches. But still, it's an effective pitch. Now, he got 4 whiffs on it, but it was all over the strike zone. He was touching the corner with that cutter. He had an awesome strikeout of Jarren Duran and an awesome strikeout of Rafael Devers, both on high cutters in this game. It was a good pitch for him in Tampa. It was kind of his number 2 offering this year with the Rays, but it's gone to the number 1 pitch in Baltimore, and that is certainly something that they identified that Eflin could use to his advantage, and he's done it. And it was mostly a fastball approach, right? Cutter, four-seamer, sinker on the night. accounted for 73 of his 87 pitches. And the Red Sox just had no idea what to do with it against Zach Eflin. And when you add in what he's done with those cutters, it's ridiculous. Yoshida had a leadoff single in the fifth inning off a cutter on the first pitch of the inning, hit one off the wall and right. It bounced right to Santander. Yoshida stopped it first. That was the first and still only hit Eflin has allowed on his cutter since he joined the Orioles. That is how good that pitch has been. The one hit has been a single. And the strikeouts are going up. That's one thing. With the Rays, Eflin had an 18.9% strikeout rate and a 2.8% walk rate. That's not a lot of Ks, but obviously an elite walk rate. With the Orioles, he's now striking out 24.5% of batters, which is honestly a really good strikeout rate. That is up 6%. And his walk rate has dropped down to 2%, which is like best in baseball if you spread that out throughout the whole season. So not only has he struck out more guys, but he hasn't had to sacrifice the command. He hates walks, and he still doesn't give up walks. It has just been amazing to add into this rotation. It's fun to watch him pitch every 5 nights. Second thing you need to know from this win, maybe Gunnar Henderson is finding his home run stroke once again. Gunnar, who hit 28 home runs in the first half of the season, has still been hitting since the All-Star break, just not the homers. Coming into Wednesday's game against the Nats, Gunnar had just 1 home run since the All-Star game. And then he hit a 2-run homer in the first inning on Wednesday, and then he hit another 2-run homer on Thursday. This one for Gunnar coming in the 4th inning off of Nick Pivetta, putting the Orioles up 2-1 at the time. For Gunnar, it was home run number 31 on the season, 110.8 miles per hour off the bat, 403 feet, just a laser homer into the flag court. And he's done that 2 games in a row, just laser home runs to right field. And even without the homers, like he's got an OPS well over 900 in the month of August. So even without the long ball, he's still hitting incredibly well. He's playing better and better shortstop. He's kind of past that little glitch he had defensively. Yeah, he just keeps hitting. And if the home runs are coming back, like it looks like they are these last 2 nights, if he goes back on an MVP pace over the last month and a half, that's when the Orioles can glide to another level again. Third thing you need to know from the win over the Red Sox is that once again, for the second straight night, despite it not being a gigantic Orioles offensive output, right? 5 runs on 8 hits. That is a really solid night offensively. It's not anything crazy, but it's solid. But the Orioles continued to add on. They got the lead on the Gunnar homer to go up 2-1 in the 4th, and Brandon Hyde has talked about we're having trouble adding on to our leads late in games. They did it Wednesday when they got 2 runs in the 7th against the Nationals to give themselves a little bit of breathing room, and they did it even more consistently on Thursday. They came up with 1 in the 5th. Cedric Mullins with a solo home run that just got out of there over the right field wall for his 13th of the year. They picked up 1 in the 6th. Ryan Mountcastle with a pinch hit RBI single to go up 4-1. Shout out to Brandon Hyde, pinch hitter at the right time. And then Colton Cowser with a 2-out RBI double in the 7th extended the lead 1 more batter after a James McCann 2-out single. And McCann was putting it all out there, scoring from first on the double to center by Cowser to extend the lead. That was all the speed he had to get around those bases, but he did score. And just adding on is a huge part of this Orioles offense to keep the pressure on opposing pitchers. It's now back-to-back nights that they've done it, which has been fantastic to see. Fourth thing you need to know from that Thursday night win is that Gregory Soto once again got a high leverage chance. Now, Soto, who was a former closer, all-star closer back-to-back years with the Tigers, then was a good setup man with the Phillies, then was kind of an okay middle relief guy with the Phillies before he was traded to the Orioles at the deadline. And his first 3 appearances with the O's were not very good. So Brandon Hyde kind of moved him out of leverage. His last 2 outings were in super low leverage. It was late in games. The Orioles were down 5 or 6 runs, but he pitched well. 6 up, 6 down, throwing strikes in those last 2 outings. And you're like, okay, he got his reset. Now let's give him a chance to pitch in an important inning. And Brandon Hyde had said it while Soto was having his struggles. Listen, we're going to need Gregory Soto to be able to get us outs in high leverage spots if we're going to do big things this year. And Hyde is completely right, especially with Danny Coulomb, the Orioles' #1 lefty, and you could argue #1 reliever overall, still being on the injured list. Now, the O's are hoping to get him back at some point in mid-September, but that's still at least a month away. And, Cino Perez is kind of up and down. You're not really trusting Keegan Aiken. So a lefty you're going to need to rely on is Gregory Soto. And I felt like this was a perfect time to try and ease him back into high leverage. It was the seventh inning, but the Orioles did have a 3-run lead at 4-1, and it was 6, 7, 8 coming up in the Red Sox order. So at the very least, you get kind of, the bottom part of that lineup where theoretically, you're not having him face Devers, you're not having him face Duran. You're making it a little bit easier on Gregory Soto. And unfortunately, he comes out there and the first pitch he throws, he hits Masataka Yoshida in the shoulder with a 98-mile-per-hour fastball. And honestly, it didn't get a whole lot better. Now, he did strike out Danny Jansen, the pinch hitter, throw some good pitches. Then he gave up a single, and his night was over. Brandon Hyde smartly had a short leash, took him out with first and third and 1 out, preserving the 4-1 lead. Now, he threw strikes to Jansen, and he threw nasty stuff for the strikeout. And honestly, he threw strikes to the next batter he faced as well, just didn't work out and gave up a hit to Rafaela. It looked better than some of the complete blowups he had, but it's just like he needs to figure it out. And I don't blame Brandon Hyde at all for putting him back in that spot. Again, at the very least, for the next month until Coulomb comes back, you're going to need Soto to come up big in some of these high leverage spots. So you find a spot that's not, 1 run in the 8th, 3 runs in the 7th, bottom of the order. That should be a spot where he can thrive. And again, he hit a batter, then he balked. He'll find it. I think the stuff is so good. He's got a history, but the O's are going to be not fully relying on him, but he's going to need to get some big outs down the stretch. And hopefully he can become that guy at some point for Baltimore. But the fifth and final thing you need to know is that, hey, the rest of the bullpen came in and did its job. When Hyde came out of the dugout to remove Soto with runners on the corners and 1 away and a 4-1 lead in the 7th, he went to Burch Smith, who was kind of picked up off the street after being released by the Marlins and has found himself into a high leverage role with the Orioles. And what does Burch Smith do? Rolls a 6-4-3 double play on the first batter he faces, gets out of the jam, keeps it a 4-1 game. Then Cionel Perez comes in the 8th, and although he did issue a 1-out walk, what he did to strike out Rafael Devers to end that inning and put up a 0 in the 8th, back-to-back 98-mile-per-hour fastballs, one at the letters, swing and a miss, one on the outside corner, swing and a miss. That was filthy Cionel Perez for the 0. And then Yennier Cano comes in the 9th, gets a bunch of ground balls. Wasn't a save situation, 4-run lead, but he puts up the 0, and the Orioles get the win. Another pretty straightforward, good-looking win for the O's on back-to-back nights to take the first game from the Red Sox and jump back into first place in the AL East. But the Orioles, they also made an intriguing roster move before Thursday's game, because one guy who was definitely celebrating on Wednesday, Coby Mayo, got his first hit, didn't get to celebrate with the O's on Thursday because he was sent back to AAA Norfolk before the game. Well, coming up next, I'll tell you why the Orioles made the move and what it means for Mayo and the O's roster moving forward. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Liquid IV. When you're taking in America's pastime, don't forget to hydrate with Liquid IV's Popsicle Firecracker flavor, a surefire summer hit. Get hydrated with electrolytes, essential vitamins, and clinically tested nutrients from the #1 powdered hydration brand in America. Because baseball and summer, well, they go together like Liquid IV and indulgent hydration. Now, I am drinking water basically all day long, but even for me, it's still tough to stay hydrated throughout the day. Liquid IV for me kind of fills in those hydration gaps at any time, whether it's, I'm playing volleyball, I'm playing softball, maybe on a flight, it's just a hot day outside, whatever it is, Liquid IV comes in clutch. You tear, you pour, and you live more. Just one stick plus 16 ounces of water hydrates better than water alone. So no more thirsty summers when you indulge in hydration with Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code MLB at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code MLB at liquidiv.com. So the O's picked up the win 5-1 over the Red Sox on Thursday night, but they did it without Coby Mayo, who was optioned back to AAA Norfolk in a roster move on Thursday. Infielder Eflin Soto was recalled to the big league roster to take Mayo's spot. So let's kind of talk about why the Orioles did this. Now, for Mayo, it was a big night on Wednesday. He got a walk. He finally got his first hit, a single into left field after starting 0 for 16 at the plate after making his major league debut. And yes, the hit was amazing, and he looked a little bit better in those plate appearances on Wednesday. You got to remember that he was still 1 for 17 and overall playing kind of a shaky third base. And the Orioles clearly were not ready to at least stick him in there every day at third base with Jordan Westburg still out with the broken hand. And we're looking at, at the least another month without Jordan Westburg in there for the Orioles. You got to find some sort of answer at third. And I don't think the O's want to play Ramon Urias every single day, but they also weren't ready to play Coby Mayo every single day. And that was pretty clear. Whether it was the struggles early with the bat, the struggles he still has with the glove, he's just not an everyday third baseman yet. And the struggles, the 1 for 17, really doesn't bother me at all. And it's because we've seen it from every single Orioles prospect. And yet a lot of Orioles fans continue to freak out every time it happens, whether it's Adley Rutschman. He was awful those first 3 weeks. Whether it's Jackson Holliday, he was unplayable and had to be sent down. Whether it was Gunnar Henderson hitting under 200 the first 2 months of last year. Whether it was Colton Cowser being kind of a disaster and having to be sent back down. These guys go back, they make adjustments, and guess what? Jackson Holliday, Adley Rutschman, Gunnar Henderson, Colton Cowser, they've all either come back to the big leagues and figured it out, or some of those guys got to work it out, but they still turned into stars. And I still think Coby Mayo is going to be a star, at least at the plate. We've seen this with every O's hitting prospect. We've seen it with a lot of prospects in general. The gap has never been bigger between the lack of quality pitching in AAA and the quality of pitching in the major leagues. It is really hard to hit in the major leagues, and the O's coveted prospects who turn into good players are showing you that early in their career. But the tough part here is we're not in the rebuild anymore. We're in a division race. And the tough part is he's getting called up in August. And I honestly think that the earliest the Orioles were considering calling up Coby Mayo this year was going to be as the essentially the hitter for the expanded roster September call-up. I think that was the earliest they were planning on it. And then Jordan Westburg got hurt. And you looked around and you just said, even if we don't think he's 100% ready, our best option to win games right now is Coby Mayo. And that was the correct call a couple of weeks ago when they brought him up. Unfortunately, it just didn't work out. And even if you're going to give him a little more time to break out, you can't have a 1 for 17 in there. They were not going to play him every day anyway. It just seemed like a time where, it's not like I'm in love with the move and I was rooting for Coby Mayo to go down, but I get it. And you can understand why the Orioles did what they did. Now, Livan Soto was the guy called up to replace him, left-handed hitting infielder who can play all around the diamond, especially in the dirt. And he's mostly kind of a slap hitter, a singles hitter. He did hit in kind of a short sample size, 400 in his first big league season. It was like 100 at-bats or something, even less than that, with the Angels in 2022. His third stint around with the Orioles. Remember, Soto actually came up for a day after Jordan Westburg got hurt and then was sent back down, and up came Coby Mayo. Soto, who the O's got back, along with Austin Slater in that trade for cash with the Reds at the deadline. Now, why Soto? Well, the Orioles are facing 4 right-handed pitchers against the Red Sox this weekend. It started with Nick Pivetta on Thursday night, and they're going to see 3 more righties this weekend. And we're at the point where, the O's probably would have started Coby Mayo, at least in one of those games, but they were looking like at least a platoon where Urias against righties and Mayo against lefties. That's what we had seen for the last week or so. And with all the righties in there, they probably wanted another left-handed bat in Soto, but more like they were planning on starting Urias at least 3 and maybe all 4 of those games at third base. And quite frankly, Coby Mayo right now is not the greatest bench piece, especially with how the rest of the Orioles bench plays out with guys like Eloy Jimenez, who's strictly a DH out there, and you've got maybe Ryan O'Hearn on the bench at times. You're not looking at a lot of versatile guys on the Orioles bench. So with Coby Mayo, who struggles defensively at third base and at first base, it's not a guy you're going to be able to move around the diamond if you bring him out there. Soto is. You can play him at all 3 infield positions at any time, and he can give you solid defense. So it's likely Urias starts all 4 games. Soto could maybe pinch hit, but it's more likely he just comes in late defensively. If there's like a big spot and maybe Urias gets pinch hit for late in the game, you can just plop Soto in there and feel better about his defense at third base later in a game if you do have to make that move. Now, others may be wondering, okay, why wasn't it J.D. Davis? Davis, been a big leaguer for years now. The Orioles brought him in on a minor league deal a couple of weeks ago. He's been hitting well in Norfolk since they signed him. Why not bring him up to give a more veteran, proven presence? Well, I honestly think it eventually is going to be J.D. Davis, but I think this is purely about the matchups the Orioles are going to see this weekend. I think once they bring up J.D. Davis, he's going to be in a platoon and will more than likely only start against left-handed pitching as a right-handed hitter. Now, they're going to see 4 straight righties against the Red Sox this weekend. So instead of JD Davis, who's a little more limited defensively, bring up Soto, who gives you a lot of versatility off the bench if you need it. Again, he might not even play Levan Soto all weekend. But next week, the Orioles get the Mets for 3 and the Astros for 4. They are, if pitchers stay on schedule, going to see 5 left-handed pitchers in those 7 games next week. More than likely, they're going to see left-handed starters in all 3 games against the Mets. It looks like, at least it's lining up, to go Jose Quintana, David Peterson, Sean Manaea, starting for the Mets in all 3 games. Those are all 3 lefties that the Orioles could see. I think Davis comes up, Soto goes back to AAA on Monday, and JD Davis gets some starts against those lefties, along with Eloy Jimenez, Austin Slater, and guys like that. And then the Astros have 2 lefties in their rotation, and both of them are scheduled to pitch in that 4-game series. That's Framber Valdez and Yusei Kikuchi are both scheduled to go as well. So you're going to want your right-handed hitters. That's when I think you call up Davis. Soto gives you more versatility against the righties. Then you flip to Davis when the lefties come up. Now, you could also say, okay, well, why didn't you just keep Mayo around, put him on the bench for this weekend, and then go to him against all those lefties next week? Well, again, every game matters. And if you're going to not start Mayo against the righties, you'd rather have someone like Soto on your bench who just gives you more versatility defensively. I think that is the thinking for the Orioles. If JD Davis works out eventually, what I think is going to happen, he may be the guy who just sticks around until Westberg comes back. But if he doesn't work out, you can always at some point in September go back to Coby Mayo. He could easily come back in 10 days. He could come back on September 1st when the rosters expand and you can get another hitter, especially if Heston Kjerstad is not ready to come back. I could easily see Mayo getting a second stint then when you can add one more hitter to your roster. And he could have another chance to even get some more playing time if Jordan Westberg is still going to be out deep into September. So this doesn't even close a book on Coby Mayo's 2024 with the Orioles. But for now, I think a little reset would do him good. And in terms of the roster, I think we see Soto, then we see Davis against the lefties, and then you kind of get to the end of that Houston series next week, and you kind of reset from there and see, all right, how do things look? Coby Mayo would then be eligible to come back after the 10 days, and you can kind of reevaluate. Because, again, you're just trying to mix and match and get yourself to the point where Westberg can come back. He was such a steady presence. It hurts to not have him in this lineup. The O's are going to do their best here to kind of patchwork it until Westberg can return from that broken hand. We got 2 more roster move things, or one roster move, one organization move, and they were both exciting. One on a maybe that'll work out level, and one on a this is huge for Orioles fans level. We'll get to both of those to finish off a Friday pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks. For me, the most fun and exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. How do you play it? Well, all you do after you, of course, download the Prize Picks app is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. So take a look at the WNBA. Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, Brianna Stewart, Asia Wilson. It goes on and on. They'll give you a number of Prize Picks, more or less than 15.5 points for Angel Reese. I'm taking the over on that one. More or less than 8.5 rebounds for Angel Reese. I'm taking the more on that one as well. You just make those picks, and then you win. You watch the cash roll in. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. That's code LOCKEDONMLB on Prize Picks for a deposit match up to $100. At Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Couple more Orioles notes before we get out of here on a Friday episode. First, the Orioles added another depth reliever on a minor league deal on Thursday. Jon Heyman first reporting that the Orioles have signed Matt Bowman to a minor league deal. He will report to AAA Norfolk. Bowman, a 33-year-old right-hander, actually a Maryland native of Chevy Chase, Maryland, went to the St. Albans School in D.C., then went to Princeton, and was eventually drafted by the Mets in the 13th round in 2012. Got to the Cardinals, made his major league debut in 2016, was a pretty important part of their bullpen for a couple of years. Then after that, bounced around for a bit. He went to Cincinnati. Then he got Tommy John surgery in 2020, missed all of 21 and 22, pitched for the Yankees a little bit last year, Then he's bounced around this year between AAA and the big leagues in 2024. He has been with the Twins, the Diamondbacks, and the Mariners this year. And in total, in his big league games between his three teams this year, 10 appearances, 15 innings. He's got a 5.40 ERA in those 15 innings of work. It's 9 runs on 11 hits with 3 homers allowed. He's hit 2 batters. He struck out 10. He's walked 7. Not the greatest stats that you're ever going to see from Matt Bowman, but it's kind of an interesting pitch mix and interesting stuff that he can put together. It's really a 4-pitch mix. It's a sinker, sweeper, splitter, and cutter that Bowman throws. You're going to see a lot of sinkers, 41%, sweeper, 25%, splitter, 18%, cutter, 16%. The splitter was the big strikeout pitch before he got his Tommy John. But the weird thing with Bowman was he came back from the Tommy John surgery and he redid his pitch mix a little bit. He completely dropped his 4-seamer. He turned his slider into a sweeper. He started throwing more sinkers. But the other thing was he kind of changed his arm angle. He was kind of a violent over the top with a weird whippy delivery, especially when he was with the Cardinals and before he got his Tommy John. But you can see here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page, if you're watching, of course, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. But this is a chart from Baseball Savant and StatCast on Matt Bowman's average release height in terms of the vertical release. And you see there on the left part of your screen, that's before the Tommy John 2016 through 2019, pretty high vertical release. Then you see on the right, there's the gap where he didn't pitch in the big leagues. Then you see on the right, 2023 and 24, much, much lower release height. He's not truly a sidearmer, but he has certainly dropped a lot further down release-wise. And it's kind of changed the movement on his pitches. It's also changed what he has thrown. But through all that, the splitter has still been really good. Opponents hitting just 167 against it. And his sinker has just been a ground ball machine this year. Opponents hitting 179. The sweeper's been hit well. I think the Orioles will try and tweak the sweeper or maybe go back to a traditional slider or curveball. But it's a good splitter. It's, a fastball with not the world's greatest velocity, but he's, sinker 92, 93 with that pitch, and he's able to throw strikes with it as well. I just kind of always liked Matt Bowman, not just because he's a Maryland native, but I thought that the stuff was kind of nasty. Even with the new delivery, it's still just funky in a different way. He used to have a funky delivery. Now it's a different kind of funky delivery. And that's kind of stuff that, hey, if you only need 10, 12, 14 innings out of him down the stretch, it could trip up opposing batters enough that it could be good. And the other thing is the Orioles got a pretty good look at him, and I can see why the O's want him on this roster, because even though he only pitched in 10 games this year, 2 of them were against the Orioles. And in those 2 games, he combined for 5 innings of 1 run ball on 1 hit with 3 Ks and 2 walks. Only run he allowed was all the way back in April. First batter he faced all season out of the bullpen for the Twins, allowed a solo home run on a sweeper to Gunnar Henderson, did not allow a home run after that, at least against the Orioles, and didn't throw a lot of sweepers to lefties after that as well. But he's just kind of another depth reliever to add to the mix. And hey, there's a chance that the O's could find another diamond in the rough like they did with Birch Smith. And there are open spots in this bullpen right now, especially, you're looking at Brian Baker's spot. That is completely up for grabs. Matt Bowman could certainly, it's kind of a similar mix to what Brian Baker throws. I could easily see him being just a better version of Brian Baker and taking over that spot. Now, there is an interesting part of his contract, and for the next 2 minutes or so, we're going to nerd out on MLB contracts here, so get ready for this. Now, John Heyman reporting this as well. The first interesting thing is there is an upward mobility clause in Bowman's minor league deal with the Orioles that comes into play August 22nd, so basically 1 week after he signed the deal. If the Orioles have not promoted him to the majors by August 22nd, the O's have to basically offer him up to every other team in Major League Baseball, and that team can take him, but only if they are guaranteeing him a spot on the major league roster. So if another team says, yes, we're going to put him on the big league roster, the Orioles have 2 options. One, they could just call him up then and they could keep him, or they would then have the ability to actually trade him to that team. And it can be for something. You can get some cash. You can get a prospect because he is not on the 40-man roster. He's still eligible to be traded even after the deadline. If all other 29 teams say no, the Orioles can still keep him in AAA Norfolk on the roster. But then 6 days later, he has an opt-out on August 28th. What that means is if Bowman is still in AAA Norfolk with the Orioles on August 28th, he has the option to trigger that opt-out, which he will, because he's going to want to be on a big league team. And if he's not by there, he's going to trigger it. That basically means he can make himself a free agent. So at that point, the Orioles would have 48 hours to call him up to the big leagues. If they don't call him up, Bowman becomes a free agent again and still would have a little bit of time to sign with a team before September 1st. And remember, with the roster rules to be postseason eligible, you've got to be on a team's 40-man roster before September 1st. So that would give Bowman a little bit of time if he feels like there's another chance for him to be on a big league roster to get on a team and get postseason eligible. So that was me just nerding out on contracts. It's really interesting, especially late in seasons, how these minor league deals work with veteran guys who are trying to get back on a team and maybe make a postseason roster. But half of me being excited about Matt Bowman is that contract stuff. The other half is I think he's got interesting stuff. And I would not be surprised at all if Bowman throws some innings out of the Orioles bullpen down the stretch this year. Last piece of news, though, last and certainly not least, Kevin Brown is sticking around in Baltimore. The reporting was throughout the year that Kevin Brown's contract with the Orioles in Masson was up after the 2024 season. We know the turmoil he went through with specifically John Angelos last year being suspended for 2 weeks for doing literally nothing. It was probably the dumbest thing that John Angelos did among many dumb things as owner of the Orioles. But you would think he's in a much better graces with the new ownership group and David Rubenstein. And the Orioles announced that they have inked him to a contract extension, which means he is sticking around. Now, the Orioles didn't announce how many years it was, but Jim Palmer did say on the Masson broadcast Thursday, like, some, side comment was like, hey, you got a 4-year extension, blah, blah, blah. I think Palmer revealed that it is a 4-year extension for Kevin Brown, which would keep him in Baltimore through at least the 2028 season as the main TV Masson play-by-play voice of the Orioles. Brown is not just amazing for O's fans and amazing at this job. He's an incredible announcer when he does, college basketball and football and baseball and the College World Series at ESPN. He is one of my favorite announcers in the game right now, not just because I watch him all summer doing Orioles games, but just because I think he's super, super talented, has been awesome to people in the Baltimore community, been awesome to people in the Orioles community. Orioles fans been amazing to me in my interactions with him. Kevin's just an awesome guy, an amazingly talented announcer, and the Orioles are so lucky to have him, and we are even luckier to have him around for the next 4 years and hopefully more as I hope as the longtime voice of the Orioles. So get ready for some more Blink-182 on the Masson broadcast. For a long, long time, Kevin Brown remains the main voice of the Baltimore Orioles. But that'll do it for today. That'll do it for this week on the podcast. Orioles with 3 more games against the Red Sox coming up at the Yard this weekend. And then I will be back on Monday recapping the final 3 games of this series between the O's and the Sox. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.